Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the AME Food Testing Show. Today's guest is Gianluca Tognon, an Italian biologist who specializes in food science and human nutrition. He's presently employed as a researcher at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. He's also an adjunct teacher at the Master in Human Nutrition at the University of Pavia, Italy. That's just south of Switzerland on the map. At the beginning of his career, he worked in the oncology field at the Mario Negri Institute in Milan, but has subsequently developed a strong interest in human nutrition, which ended in his furtherance in the obtaining of a Doctor of Science, or ScD, in food science and human nutrition, followed by a 4-year experience in nutritional epidemiology at the Cancer Prevention Institute in Florence, Italy. Dr. Tognon has worked on different European projects on diet and health, and is presently involved on a project on the association between diet and survival in the Scandinavian population. He has recently published the results of 2 studies showing a positive association between a Mediterranean-like dietary pattern and survival. His interest in chemicals came from a collaboration with the Italian WWF during an international campaign aimed to support the approval of the REACH legislation in toxics by the European Parliament. Last year, he published a book of the dangers of chemical exposure, and he's presently looking for other opportunities in this field. So let's introduce Dr. Tognon in his topic, toxic chemical contaminants in food products. Dr. Tognon, would you like to add anything to your biography?
Well, hi. First of all, I can tell you that we have very recently, last week, published an article on Mediterranean diet and mortality based on a study in a population living in North Sweden, and you can find it online at the Journal of Nutrition website. So there's a very recent publication that we were able to do. But the rest, I think you described my experience very, very thoroughly. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me today to talk about this subject.
Well, Dr. Tognon, you're extremely welcome. I'd like to begin our discussion with your general explanation of what are adulterants in food products.
Well, I generally use the definition of contaminants are a very huge word because there are so many contaminants which can be contained in food products. I generally start saying that you can find both natural contaminants as well as what I call synthetic contaminants, so contaminants of human origin. The natural contaminants are, for instance, natural toxins, like the mycotoxins, which can be classified as aflatoxins, ochratoxins, etc., which can be also very dangerous because some of them are cancerogenic. While the contaminants of human origin, so what I call the synthetics products, can be really, really many, and we're generally used to terms like pesticides or but heavy metals, but there are many other products which can be found in food which are derived from the natural environment. Some of these are, plastifiers, solvents, but also other compounds like medications or residual or veterinary medications. Today I would like to focus more on those contaminants which are of industrial origins, because there are many of these compounds which have been produced for many years, and some are still produced, some others are not produced anymore by industries. But the thing is that many of these compounds which pollute the environment are so stable, so difficult to be integrated by the organism in the natural environment, that even though many of them have already been discontinued, so they're forbidden, their use and their production is forbidden, they can still be found both in the environment and also in human and animal organisms, as well as in food. And some examples, some very easy examples, are the DDT, which is an insecticide which has been forbidden in Western countries many years ago, although in some countries the word can be still used. Or, for instance, PCBs, which were used many years ago in the electric additives, and which are so stable in the environment that can still be found. And these compounds are now called persistent organic pollutants. So they are pollutants persistent in the environment. Well, besides this, there are many other compounds which we'll probably talk about today, which are still produced by industries and which are becoming raising problems.
Excellent discussion. What exactly are toxic chemicals in food? What's the definition of a toxic chemical?
Well, a toxic chemical is a compound of chemical origin which can affect in some way the human health, if we're talking about human health, or they can affect also animal health. There are many different ways in which these compounds can affect the health, and let me make some examples. For instance, some products, some chemical compounds which are produced now by industries and can be found in foods are brominated compounds, like the brominated flame retardants, which are compounds used to reduce inflammability of many everyday products, or plastifiers as phthalates, or perfluorinated compounds. So these are examples of recent compounds which are contained in many everyday products. How do they affect human health? Well, recently we have understood, many researchers have found that these chemicals have a chemical structure which is similar to the human hormones and the animal hormones. And particularly, they can be similar to thyroid hormones or even sexual hormones. And the thing is that being similar to these natural chemicals, so to say, they can interfere with their functioning inside the organism. So, for instance, if a compound like dioxins is similar to the sexual, so estrogens and testosterone hormones, they can, for instance, affect fertility, or they can increase the risk of reproductive cancers. On the other side, if they're similar to the thyroid hormones, they can affect both the metabolism, but also at the fetal level during the period pre-birth. Thyroid hormones are important in neurodevelopment. So if the fetus is exposed to these chemicals through his mother, for instance, the neurodevelopment of the fetus can really be affected. And then finally, there are many dangerous compounds which are classified as carcinogenic, mutagenic, so they can also interfere with the DNA, so they can increase the risk of cancer. So there are many ways through which the chemicals can affect health. These are just two examples. So the cancerogenity, the interaction with DNA, and also the interaction with the hormones.
So how do these environmental pollutants get into foods that are actually produced and distributed in the market?
Yeah, exactly. Well, one has to consider that these compounds can be released in the environment by leakage from waste discharges or through incinerations, or even leakage from some industries or residuals of old closed industries. There are many ways. And the thing is that these contaminants have really become ubiquitarian on the Earth's surface. They can be found everywhere. there are some theories saying that these compounds can evaporate at certain latitudes, and then they can be transported by winds and recondensate somewhere else. The result is that these contaminants pollute the whole Earth. And being present everywhere, it's not really difficult to guess that they can be taken up by very simple organisms living in soils or living in waters. So, for instance, in water, these compounds can be taken up, absorbed by plankton, and then transmitted, for instance, to fish. But being present everywhere they get into the very first level of the food chain, and then they can be transmitted from one level to the other one, of course, because each level of the food chain feeds the following one. So the basic level feeds the up level. And these compounds have another characteristics. Many of them are not only persistent in the environment, but they can also bioaccumulate. So they accumulate into the organism. So when you eat another animal, you're exposed to you assume the chemicals which are contained in his organism. And this, of course, is another way that justifies why we found these compounds in our foods.
Incredible. So if we consume as humans an animal that has been aggregating these chemicals, then the net effect to us is actually increased. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And I can tell you that if you test our blood or any animal blood, you will find a lot of compounds, a lot of chemicals which contaminates. When I used to be involved in the WWF campaign, we did a test on some people, and we were able to measure a lot of these compounds, and that was really striking.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and yes, because if you take a blood sample of my blood, of your blood, and you can find not only these chemicals that I mentioned before, so the most recent, like the flame retardants of plastifiers, but you find, again, as I told you before, many of those compounds whose production has been discontinued many years ago. So you can still find PCBs, you find DDT metabolites, and the number of these compounds is really huge, and it's really difficult to predict how these compounds can interact each other in disturbing our health. So there are still many studies ongoing to determine this.
Excellent. Well, I have a question which most of our audience are either food producers, food quality managers, food safety managers, or food security managers. This is a little bit risky for them. Which foods are more at risk for these toxic chemical contaminants?
Well, this, I have to say, is a very difficult question. It's not really easy to answer. But especially because the huge numbers of potential compounds that you can find in foods is so big that it's really difficult to monitor all of them. So what happens in Western countries like Europe, the US, but also many others, is that there are official monitoring of possible compounds contained in foodstuffs. So generally, there is an evaluation of the contamination levels of mycotoxins, pesticides, heavy metals. But of course, for obvious reasons, there are not official monitoring of all possible compounds that can be found in foods. So what I can tell you are some general rules which to me can help identify those foodstuffs which are more at risk of being more contaminated than the others. Well, so as a general rule, I generally recommend to reduce the intake, for instance, of animal products, because most of these chemical compounds which can affect our health are generally hydrophobic, and when they accumulate in the organism accumulate in the adipose tissue, since they're soluble in fats. And so as a natural consequence of these, I would consider animal products, so meat products and dairy products, more at risk of contamination than any other products. It is true that vegetables also can be exposed to some other chemicals because they're exposed, for instance, to pesticides, but at least they have no fats, so they have a reduced capacity of accumulate these kind of compounds. And most of all, pesticides in foodstuff, in vegetables and fruit, are continually monitored, while there are many other compounds which can be found in the adipose tissues of the animals we eat and also in their meat that are not really monitored. Then, as a general rule, again, as another rule, I would, of course, reduce the intake of canned food, because although they are controlled nowadays, they have reduced the number of possible compounds which are included in cans. I would generally be quite concerned in recommending a high intake of this kind of products. Another thing that generally worries me is the fact that many foods nowadays are sold in plastic containers, and they're also supposed to be heated in these containers. So people take them and put the whole plastic container with their food into the microwaves and generally turn the microwave at very high power. And then I imagine that heating foodstuffs at high temperature, which can be reached very easily inside the microwaves, can be dangerous because there can be some leakage. And finally, there's a very long discussion regarding fish. Well, because you expect, of course, that many pollutants in the environment can be collected by water basins, so percolation through soils can bring many chemicals to lakes, rivers, seas. So fish is, of course, prone to contamination. And in fact, some studies show that fish can be contaminated, for instance, by methyl mercury, but also other contaminants. However, there's a general recommendation from, I think, most of nutritionists of consuming at least 1 or 2 portions a week of fish. So my advice is that one should, try to eat at least 1 or 2 portions a week of fish, but what one could consider is to try to increase the variety of species and of fishes of different origins, and also of fishes of different size. In Italy, for instance, we recommend generally what we call the blue fish, so anchovies, mackerels, sardines, which are small fishes, but which can provide anyway a lot of omega-3s, so they can contain good fats. So fish is tricky foodstuff because it can be on one side contaminated and on the other side have a lot of healthy properties. So my advice is to increase the varieties at least and not to focus always on the same species and type of fish. But it's very complicated to reply to these questions because it's difficult to trace all of the potential compounds included in foodstuffs. There are many variables which can really influence. These are just my ideas and general rules.
Well, Dr. Tognon, you've given us an excellent summary of the basic foodstuffs between vegetables. You have not addressed fruit per se, but you have addressed fish. It looks like in an ancillary way you've addressed chicken and beef, which are the staples here in the United States. Why should we be concerned about a commercial product being contaminated with these toxic chemicals?
Well, when we talk about environmental chemicals, it's something that includes everything, because they can also, being present everywhere in the environment, they can not only contaminate commercial products, but they can also contaminate those products that we grow in our home garden. So, but what should really concern us in relation to the exposure of so many compounds is, first of all, the fact that there are too many chemical compounds in the environment. And the number is really huge. We're talking about tens of thousands of compounds which are in use presently, to which you have to add many other compounds still in the environment, although they're not produced anymore because they're persistent. And then, of course, many of these contaminants, like the brominated compounds or the chlorinated compounds, are persistent in the environment and they can bioaccumulate. So the more you are exposed, the more the highest the burdens is in your organism of these chemicals. Then there are still a lot of compounds that can be found in foods and in the environment which are cancerogenic, mutagenic, or toxic for the endocrine system. There are many solvents, phthalates, brominated compounds which can have these effects, and this is another matter of concern. We don't know how these compounds can interact with each other and influence our health. And as a last thing, there's something which is really concerning, which are children, of course, because the children have a different exposure to compounds. They can be more at risk. First, because these compounds, we said that they can interact with hormones and they can interact with the metabolism. And the child is an organism in development, so it's particularly sensitive to this kind of exposure. Then children have, compared to an adult, absorbed more water, air, and also energy from food per unit of its weight compared to an adult. So for every kilos of weight, the children absorb more energy, more water, more air, and consequently more chemicals. And importantly, they also have a reduced capacity of eliminate these chemicals compared to an adult. So there are many, many reasons why we should be concerned and we should try to regulate more this field.
Excellent. Addressing regulation, can you explain what the European regulation known as REACH relates to as far as chemicals?
Yes. Well, I was involved in the promotion of this regulation many years ago, as you mentioned before. Well, REACH is a very important regulation, and it's the regulatory framework that we have in Europe for the regulation of compounds. So REACH is a European regulation, which is the acronym of registration, evaluation, and authorization of chemicals, and also restrictions. So what it requires is that all compounds which are produced or imported in the European Union must be registered. And during the registration process, the importer or the producer has to register not only the compound but also produce a dossier describing the uses and also the possible dangers coming from these compounds. Well, presently there are around 150,000 chemicals which have been registered in the European Union. The authorities that manage the registration and subsequently the evaluation is the European Chemical Agency, which is based in Helsinki. And this authority has the purpose of manage the registration, evaluates the compounds, but most importantly, it has to identify all those compounds which are of very high concern. Which are these compounds? Of course, those that can have a cancerogenic potential or can be toxic for the endocrine system, or those which are persistent in the environment and able to bioaccumulate. For these compounds, well, one would expect that they should be immediately discontinued, but this of course is not always possible. So they generally go through an authorization procedures, which can end with the restriction or partial restriction of the use of these compounds. But on the other hand, some compounds, if the appliers, so the industry, is able to demonstrate that the risk is adequately controlled and that there are some socio-economical benefits in using these compounds, which can in some way outweigh the risk, which is difficult to understand. But it's possible. Then an authorization is given. The authorization is not forever, but it's until what is called the sunset date. So the authorities say, okay, you're authorized to use this compound, even though it is dangerous, but we give you this authorization until a certain date. Then when the industry or the importer identifies a replacement for this dangerous compound, then a substitution plan is implemented, and hopefully this chemical is replaced with another one which is less dangerous. And finally, an important thing is that when a chemical is included in the candidate list, which brings to the authorization procedure, then every citizen in Europe has the right to know, which means that every citizen has the right to ask a company selling a particular product if one of these compounds included in this candidate list, so those that are going to be authorized or restricted, are contained in the product. And I think that this is an important aspect because citizens have the right to know more about what they're exposed to.
Very good. Dr. Tognon, I have a question for you. It's maybe highly sensitive. I would appreciate if you could address those toxics which you feel, in your opinion, should be ruled out of usage in industry, particularly in the food production area.
Well, there are many compounds, of course, those that everybody reckons should be ruled out, as all the cancerogenic compounds, all the endocrine disruptors, so all those that interferes with hormones, and all compounds which have shown to be persistent and bioaccumulative in the environment. I can mention an excellent resource that I was able to find online, which helps you to identify a lot of these compounds. Many NGOs have collaborated to produce a list of these compounds, which can be downloaded, for instance, from the International Chemical Secretariat's website online. And I have it here on my desk, and there's a long list of more than 300 compounds which are considered very dangerous and which should be ruled out as soon as possible. I can just mention some of them. For instance, there's among the cancerogenic or possible cancerogenic, there's the acrylonitrile, which is used in the production of some kind of plastics called acrylic, or a term that we're all quite familiar with. Then there's hydrazine, which is an herbicide, which is very, very dangerous. Then you can find also some phthalates, for instance, like the diethyl or the diexyl phthalates, which are known to interfere with the endocrine system. Then there are some parabens, for instance, the propyl paraben. Parabens are esters of the parabenzoic acid, and they're used as preservatives. You can find them both in foods, in some foods, and also in personal care products. And finally, in this list, there are also some perfluorinated compounds like the PFOA, which is the acronym of the perfluoroctanoic acid, and the PFOS, which is the perfluoroctane sulfonate, which are two perfluorinated compounds used as surfactants. So they are used to they're chemicals which enables the mixing of other compounds which are maybe both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. So they're used in some industrial process. So these are just some examples, but you can find this list, and there's a very long list of compounds which are really dangerous. But as a general rule, those that should be ruled out are those which are the most persistent in the environment and in the organism, and the worst effects to our health.
Well, Dr. Tognon, I'm going to ask you a question which is not on the agenda tonight, but which, as an old chemist, having performed a number of analytical chemistry analyses using high-pressure liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, how would a food producer surveil their production or the presence of these contaminants?
Well, I'm not a chemist, so it's not very easy. I think that as a general rule, one must be concerned not only on the compounds, which are generally monitored, so the pesticides and heavy metals, but I think that one should try at least to check some general compounds. For instance, take a couple of brominated flame retardants, a couple of plastifiers, and some perfluorinated compounds, for instance. So try to analyze also some other contaminants which are not really generally monitored as a rule, because they could be an indicator of possible further contamination of other compounds. So my suggestion is to try to analyze also some of those compounds which are not freely forced to analyze. This would be a very important thing to do. Do you agree?
Excellent answer. Finally, Dr. Tognon, can you enlighten our group as to your current projects and your future interests?
Well, I am presently working inside academia, so as a researcher, and of course, my idea is to continue my career inside academia and continue working on as many possible aspects of the relationships between human nutrition and health. So we mentioned a couple today, like the Mediterranean diet projects, but also these fields of chemicals. But what I'm also interested too is to continue being active also in science dissemination. So try to be more active as a public speaker or write some other books for the general population. Because I really believe that we scientists, we should go really out there and try to explain science to people. Because there's a huge need of knowledge in this field, which is too often neglected. So that's also my proposal for the future, to continue to be active in science dissemination, not only being interested in my career and going on inside academia.
Well, Dr. Tognon, I'd like to thank you for the extreme effort that you've made to address us from Sweden and to participate in the AMA food testing show, and allow you your concluding remarks.
Well, what I generally say when we talk about these subjects of chemicals and toxics, we generally talk about industries and producers of these compounds. But what I think is that also citizens should try to be more concerned in this field and try to, if you check everybody's house, you will find a lot of chemicals, compounds, from garden products, cleaning products. There are so many products inside the house. My advice is also that the citizens should be really more concerned in regard with these issues of chemicals contamination, because there are already a lot of compounds in the environment, and it's really not good to increase the exposure by using so many compounds inside households.
Excellent recommendation. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Gianluca Tognon, for your time and your expertise, and perhaps if you find another subject which we can enlighten our food production professionals, I'd invite you back on the show.
Okay, that will be a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and look forward to having you again.
Okay,
thank you.
And bye.
Bye.